When Socrates was sentenced to die by drinking hemlock, some of his well-wishers gathered around and asked what they would do with him after he drank the hemlock and died. And he replied simply, "You'll have to catch me first." So today, this is Thursday, August 15th, 2019, and we're here at 26 2nd Avenue. We do this every Thursday here at in Manhattan. And this group of videos and presentation, because this is also happening live, these presentations are intended to give a different perspective than usual about the paranormal, supernatural, whatever you prefer to call it. And we were finishing up on a whole section which we were dealing with before, which was about the paranormal, and now we're into specific examples of the paranormal, particularly ghosts. Last week we talked about ghosts, and this week we're talking about ghosts. In the future, we'll also be talking about other things that are related, like remote viewing, like out-of-the-body experiences, astral travel. We'll be talking about soon incubus and succubus, which are interesting concept. The concept of people experiencing paralysis and fear in their bed, either just before going to sleep or just after rising. And this is an interesting phenomenon too. So these are some of the things we're going to be going over. We have a YouTube channel, and that YouTube channel is Krishna Was Up. If you go to YouTube and you type in KRISHNAWAZZUP, you'll come to this web channel in case you saw the video on some other platform. And every Thursday here we have this little session, and in this way I'm hoping to go through many different unusual examples of the world around us, which many people find puzzling and interesting, and in some cases fascinating, while other people poo-poo them completely out of existence, that these things can't happen, don't happen. They're just the product of fertile imagination, misconceptions, the product of pre-scientific thinking, or whatever you want to call it. So there's that other reaction to these kind of things. But they actually have a place in a larger explanation, the Vedic explanation, and that's why they're of interest to me, and maybe they might be of interest to you, to know that there is somewhere in this world a broad blanket of understanding that ties together all these things, besides the usual scientific everyday stuff. It ties in all these unusual things that happen on the fringes of our understanding. That's why these things, I think, are fascinating to people. They want some kind of framework to put these experiences, these situations into the context of. So that's why we're investigating them. And in the Vedic system, in the Vedic literatures, the Vedas, these things are discussed, and they are put within a larger framework. So today, these are the items that I hope to cover in our hour and 15 minutes, whatever it happens to be here today. And we will briefly go over this quote by Socrates. We will talk about White House ghosts, because if we're going to talk about the paranormal, if we're going to talk about ghosts, here in America, probably the most famous, the most easy to think about example is, of course, the White House itself, which is an interesting place where a lot of unusual things have happened there, and it is said by people who have visited there in the past and people who work there in the present that there are various unusual things happening in that location. the house of former presidents where they slept, ate and drank and did their everyday things. So we'll be talking about White House ghosts today. We're also going to explain this interesting metaphor that we call the chariot of the body. This is a very important way of understanding the idea, the concept of how these various subtle things interact with the gross world and the gross perception that we have of it. Then we're going to talk about bodily attachment. And briefly we'll mention the common viewpoint that exists in our everyday world about how DNA is supposed to somehow or another explain practically everything. Is this a reasonable way of thinking? Do scientists even think this? And finally, we're going to talk about tying some of these little threads together in a final sort of wrap-up. We're going to discuss violence, suicide, birthmarks, and reincarnation. These things are knitted together in an overall fabric. Violence, suicides, birthmarks, and reincarnation. All right, so let's start off here. We'll start off with this quote by Socrates. His well-wishers asked him what they would do with him after he drank the hemlock and died. And he said, "You'll have to catch me first," which is an interesting quip, but it shows that he was well aware of the fact that he was not his body. That's what he meant by that, "You'll have to catch me first." The body would certainly not be difficult to catch after he drank the hemlock, but something would leave. And we see that even in our everyday manner of speaking, we talk about so-and-so left, they departed, they're no longer with us. Whereas the body is certainly with us. We see it. Usually we put it in a grave, at least in the Western world we do. And it sits there for who knows how long. And as a result, certainly nothing has left. But we speak as if something has left because we intuitively understand, indeed, that is the real case. Something has left. What is that something? We're going to talk about it. It's what we call the soul, or more integratedly, if we talk about a larger aspect of it, we're talking about the subtle body combo soul, which departs the gross body at death, and sometimes departs temporarily before there is the permanent break between the body and the actual real self. So, as we mentioned last week, many different older cultures are certainly no strangers to this idea of the soul being within the body. And what death is the soul separating from the body. However, what we don't find is any kind of detailed, intricate explanation of what this thing is that leaves the body, how it does that, and what happens next. So this is where each particular religious or philosophical or paranormal various group of people have their own kind of understanding. So let's talk about, since this is the main topic today, we'll get into this interesting place, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington, D.C. The White House. George Washington was there while it was being built, but never lived to actually see it completed. Other presidents lived in there before there was any furniture or other kinds of things, so some rooms were actually vacant at certain times. And people who work there, dignitaries who have spent a little bit of time there, even heads of state who have come through there, have remarked of hearing unusual things there, things that they can't explain. And sometimes we find that there's a sound of footsteps when there's nobody there, or it should be nobody there. Nothing is captured on the closed-circuit cameras. You can imagine that this White House is probably the most security locked down place in the country, or at least it's among the most security locked down places in the country. So obviously someone can't get in there and just play pranks. But nevertheless, this place has a lot of unusual things going on with it. There are stories by people who have worked there and have visited there that they heard people washing clothes, a strange sound of water and scrubbing. And in a bygone time, there was a place where, because there was no furniture yet in the White House, one of the earlier inhabitants of the White House, they had the servants wash clothes right there in a particular aspect or a particular wing of the White House. So this unusual place has many persons who were very famous associated with it, obviously. It's the place where the United States president actually lives when he's in the country. So the most probably well-known of all these ghosts is, of course, Abraham Lincoln. And he met his death before he left office. He didn't die in the White House, but Abraham Lincoln's ghost is said to wander through the building. People go there, people hear these sounds, and many notable people have actually seen the ghost of Abraham Lincoln. So sometimes that people had seen Dolly Madison's ghost. And there was one of the first ghosts that's been really reported in the White House is Willie Lincoln's ghost. Willie Lincoln was one of Abraham's children who died at an early age. And his mother, Mary Todd Lincoln, was very disturbed, of course, by the death of her son. But she reported actually seeing the ghost of her departed son in the White House. During their stay, the Lincolns even conducted some seances. Some say that Abraham Lincoln was not so particularly disturbed, but he was not also so totally open to this kind of thinking. But he allowed his wife to do these seances, and this was something that was quite common at the time. I've said, and I said last week or 2 weeks ago, that there was a time when we actually, after the revolution, not the revolution, the Civil War, after the Civil War, there was so many deaths in so many families that spiritism or spiritualism became very, very prominent in American culture. This also happened again after the Second World War. Both of these times we see that people wanted very much to communicate with people that were in the military who had died in these battles and wanted to somehow get closure in their lives because they had seen their people, their husbands or their sons or their nephews or what have you, and they had not had the chance to talk to them before they left this world. So people were interested in trying to communicate, to try to find out something about the nature of the way they died. In some cases, people actually had their own personal witness of how this all took place. So Mary Todd Lincoln was very interested in these things, and that's why there were seances held in the White House. And it's not like the other presidents also ignored these phenomenons. Interestingly, that Harry S. Truman, who lived there, wrote many letters to his wife. And he kind of complained about, as he put it, the damn place is haunted, sure as shooting. That's how he put it in one letter to his wife. He would hear noises, he would hear footsteps, sometimes he would see things. And today even, people who are part of the staff have these episodes. There's a story about a news reporter. She was in the White House for some engagement. She had to spend the night there. And while she was asleep at night, she was in the same room with one of her associate girlfriends, and they heard some sound, and she became very terrified. She heard a sound of, first, it was some kind of music playing, not modern music, but some kind of very old-time music playing. And she couldn't figure out where it was coming from. Later on, she heard opera being sung. And, you know, there's nobody walking around or doing that in the White House at that hour of the night. She mentioned it to one of the people who work in the White House, and she said, you're not going to believe what I heard last night. And he said, listen, you're not going to believe what we hear all the time here. So this is one of those things people don't like to talk about, because if you're in an important position of managing security or managing anything in the White House where you have to be seen with very great integrity, then talking about these things is not a good way to enhance your job opportunities or your way of being understood by the people who you're working with. At any rate, still, it happens. There's a White House chief of operations who one time came up to a floor. He heard a sound, and as he looked up, he saw Abe Lincoln sitting in a chair. Of course, this was just some years ago. He saw Abe Lincoln sitting in a chair, as vivid as you can imagine. Of course, then he disappeared. It's said that, the story is there, that Winston Churchill spent some time in the White House, and one morning or late night, I don't know which it was, he got out of bed and he took a shower, and he was coming from the bathroom completely stark naked with only his cigar in his mouth. So this is Winston Churchill. And suddenly he saw the ghost of Abraham Lincoln. And Winston Churchill has a character all of his own too. So he reportedly said when he saw this visage of Abraham Lincoln, "My dear sir, you have certainly caught me at a great disadvantage." So he was not to be outdone by anyone, including Abe Lincoln's ghost. So this was Winston Churchill's experience. There was another time Queen Wilhelmina of Scandinavia was residing in the White House, and she heard a knock on her bedroom in the middle of the night. When she went, there was no one there. So these kind of things, I think she also saw some aspect of Lincoln's ghost as well. Sometimes people see Dolly Madison, sometimes people see others. There's been a report by some of the security personnel that they see various British soldiers dressed in red coats with torches in their hands, which is from the time when the White House was actually burned to the ground by the British soldiers. Of course, it was rebuilt after that. But there's a number of these kind of things going on there. Naturally, it's a place with a lot of focus, a lot of human mental energy there. It's a very unusual place because the heads of state live there, eat there, sleep there. They think there. They prepare their talks and they prepare their meetings with other heads of state there. And wars have been won, wars have been lost, wars have been planned, wars have been averted. All these kind of things have happened while various presidents have lived at this location. So naturally this place has a lot happening. And this is not, of course, the only place in the United States. There are many places like this, which officially you can say or unofficially have all these stories connected with them. There's no easy way to verify these stories, and so some people choose just not to believe because they weren't there, they didn't hear it, they didn't see it. So if you're one of those people, okay, I can understand why you don't believe. But when a person has a direct experience with particularly a ghost or something like that, then it's harder for them to just write these things off as some kind of folklore, pre-scientific thinking. Here's an interesting photograph. This was taken by one of the White House photographers some years ago. You can see it's dated. And on the right, you see the whole picture. And here, I'm sorry, on the left, on the right you see the whole picture. On the left, you see a zoom in. In the whole picture, the White House is being redone on the inside. And you don't notice it, but if you look about 2/3 or 3/4 to the left edge and 2/3 or 3/4 from the top to the bottom down, there is a little blip there, which if you zoom in, which is what this is, you'll see a transparent person in the photograph. This is commonly how ghosts will show up on photographic film. That you'll see the image of somebody, and at the same time, you will see through them. Of course, you could say this was either double exposure, but nothing else is double exposed. And you could say this is some quirk of the camera, but we see that there's 3 men standing to the right of the person who is transparent, and they're quite non-transparent. And there's this man in front on the bulldozer or front end loader, and he's not transparent. This is a phenomenon that we should get used to, that the material world has material things. These are not, spiritual things or things that are completely off the material descriptors. These are things that have material explanations because ghosts and so are part of the material world. But the realm they live in and the energies that they're made of are not the same energies we're familiar with, and that's why scientists have trouble discussing or understanding them. However, these energies are not so remote from our world that they don't have any kind of connection with our world. Obviously do. They can show up on photographic film, they can create cold and hot spots, they can make sounds that are audible to people who are living, they can come and go. They can evade capture by security personnel because they don't have a physical body. So these kind of things are a part of our world. And as we said last week, only our modern culture tries to explain all these things as just the act of imagination or misunderstanding. This is obviously true in some cases, and no one can deny it. That there are people who misunderstand things and take one thing to be another, take something to be a ghost, which indeed is just, a light on in a room, or a curtain flying out, or a dress blowing in the wind, or something like that. Yeah, I'm sure this happens. But to write off everything, that's the activity of people who are really not open-minded. So let's talk about this metaphor that is part of the whole Vedic way of seeing this in perspective. We say that there is something we call the subtle body, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in just a second. The subtle body is made of false mind, false intelligence, and false ego. It is made of material energy. It is not the soul. The soul is far more subtle than all that, and the soul actually is eternal, whereas the subtle body is not eternal. And the gross body is certainly not eternal. The elements that comprise the gross body, this carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, all these kind of main constituents of our carbon-based life form, they come together in a particular configuration. And for some time, many unusual and unlikely chemical reactions happen, and we call that life. But at some point, all those reactions cease, and we call that death. And then the body begins to disintegrate. All those different pieces, all those different systems and chemicals begin to find new places to do things. They begin to attach to other things. They begin to be taken advantage of by bacteria and insects. Eventually there's molds and other things that break it all down, and eventually we wind up with nothing left of what was once a living, walking person with a personality and desires and all those kind of things. So this gross body is material, but the subtle body is also material, but not the same kind of material that scientists usually study. This is false ego, false intelligence, and false mind. Hi, come on in. Hare Krishna. So these are interesting and important concepts to try to wrap your head around, because if you can understand them, then you begin to think about this whole group of activities, this whole phenomenon in a different light. So we have something called the senses. We have, touch or the skin, we have taste, we have the tongue, we have sight, the eyes, hearing, the ears, and the nose smells. So these five senses in this analogy or metaphor are called the horses. So it's like a chariot. A chariot is pulled by horses. And in this case, the horses are 5 in number, and they pull the chariot. In this picture, you see that there are reins, and these reins are designed to control the horses. And in this metaphor, the reins are the mind, what we in the Vedic system call the mind. Of course, the word mind is used in a number of other ways too, so I don't want to limit that this is the only way that the concept of mind is ever used in the Vedic literature. And controlling the tethers or the reins of the horses is what we call the intelligence. So the intelligence is the driver here. The intelligence is the driver, the mind is the reins, and the senses are the horses. Now, beyond that, we have the body itself, which is the chariot. So the horses are pulling the chariot. In a similar way, we find that our senses, our desires, are visual faculty, what we smell, what we taste, what we hear. It draws us in various different locations. It pulls us in a certain direction. And these four things interact with one another. We have the horses, which are the senses, the reins, which are the mind, the intelligence, which is the driver, the chariot is the body. So where is the self or the soul in this picture? And it's described as the passenger. The self or the soul is simply the passenger in this particular metaphor. How does it communicate then? Well, this is the problem. In general, it doesn't communicate. The self is being pulled along by a sequence of events. Normally, in a chariot or in a car or anything else, we have the driver directing the direction in which the chariot or the vehicle move. And that's the reasonable way to do it. But in this particular diagram, it's the other way around. It's the horses who are deciding where things wind up. And the intelligence is not directing them. Rather, the intelligence is kind of terrified and following them wherever they feel they want to go. So this is the backward way that our everyday consciousness is set up. Instead of directing our senses towards things that are part of a worthwhile goal, generally we allow our senses to direct us to what we will then conclude is things that smell nice, taste nice, look nice, sound nice, you get it. And in this way, we are directed. But we find that the senses are not one but five. So oftentimes, we are pulled in simultaneously different directions. So our trajectory through life is even more chaotic because we are not even pulled by one factor. We're pulled by five different factors, often in different directions. Sometimes we're pulled in the same direction by all five senses. As usually in sex life, that's the thing, that all five senses are immediately locked onto the same object. But in other cases, generally they're not. The soul is petrified because the soul cannot actually understand how to get out of this situation. But if the intelligence is properly trained, then the intelligence can direct the horses in a way that will actually be a benefit to the overall life of the individual or the soul itself. So that's why we say we need a GPS. In this case, the GPS is the Vedic literatures. By understanding, reading the Vedas, by trying to act in accordance with them, we recognize that some things the senses are beckoning us towards are not good for us. And as a result, we resist them, just like sometimes the driver of the horses has to resist what the horses are heading towards. This is the nature of thoughtful life, where the chariot of the body is going in a direction that is conceived of, thought of, planned, and it has some noble and higher purpose behind it. Otherwise, really the chariot of the body is proceeding in a completely random direction, and not only in one single random direction, but five different random directions. And this is a terrifying thing, because if you can imagine, if you let horses choose where the chariot's going to go, where will we go? Certainly not any place that we would probably want to go. And this brings us to the idea that rather than have the senses decide what we should do, we should have some overall conception of what's worthwhile and what's not, what will help us and what will actually cause us suffering in the long term. So I'm going to move along here to this outline here of the greater self. We'll start simple. We have something we call the soul, and we have something called the subtle body, and something we call the gross body. These are just kind of Venn diagrammy things here, where I'm doing this the most completely undetailed way, that the gross body is the thing that we're all aware of. We all have, we look at it in the mirror, and most people consider that's it. That's all there is, the gross body. It's made in, in the ancient Vedic system, it's described as being made of earth, water, fire, air, and ether. In our modern terminology, we think of it being made of hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, some sulfur and phosphorus and a few other things thrown in for good measure. But in any case, we can touch it, we can taste it, we can smell it, we can hear it. Now, within it is the subtle body. And the subtle body is also, as I've been saying, made of material energy. But these material energies are not as easy to study as the gross body is. They do exist and they are material, but they're more subtle, which means they're harder to get a handle on. Now, within the subtle body is the soul proper. The soul never dies, and the soul does not belong to this material world at all. The soul is like the player of the virtual reality computer game. So, the soul is like the driver in the car. The soul is like the player in a virtual reality game. The soul is pushing the buttons, and it's the subtle and gross body that actually act. And they're like the avatar, or the interface. And this world is real in one sense, but it's also a world that has been designed for a specific reason, to give us the backwash of our karma and to allow us to follow our various material inclinations wherever we may care to do. Here's another, same thing now with a more, little bit more detailed. So here we have the gross body. We all know what this looks like, the gross body. Within is the subtle body. And the subtle body can also, to some extent, be perceived outside the gross body. So we are talking about the whole self, the greater self, more than just the physical body. What doctors and chemists study is not the entire self. It's just a piece of it. It's the piece that's the most easy to come in contact with for material science, but it's the outside, most hard, tangible aspect. But the subtle body is also there. And the subtle body, when it leaves the gross body behind, when the subtle body leaves the gross body behind, at that point, the gross body is said to be dead, when it leaves the body behind permanently. Sometimes it may leave the gross body behind only temporarily. And within the subtle body is the soul itself. So the soul is the eternal spark that has come from another location, from another place. If we talk about a virtual reality, there must be a real reality somewhere. And in fact, there is, but it's not here. It's in the spiritual world. So that's where this spark has come from. This spark right now in the material world is compressed to a very tiny dimension. In the Vedic literature, it's described as 1/10,000th the size of the tip of a hair. Now, when the soul goes back to its original home, the spiritual world, at that point, the soul, from being a tiny spark, expands itself into being a full-fledged form. But again, it's not made out of the elements that we personally experience now in the material world. It's not made of earth, water, fire, air, and ether. That body is made out of spiritual energy. And that spiritual body is also not the same as the subtle body, which is also made out of subtle energies. In other words, false mind, false intelligence, and false ego. So at some point in every living being's sojourn through many lifetimes, many situations, the living entity will come to this realization that this is not our home, that nothing here is of any real value. We're living virtual lives over and over again and getting nothing by it except for frustrated and abused by the backwash of our own karma. So at that point, the individual begins a process we call bhakti yoga, or devotional service. And beginning this devotional service will lift the soul out of these misconceptions and out of these various material layers, where the soul will then have a tangible understanding that he does not identify with this body that he's presently inhabiting, and will one day come to an end. So when the soul leaves the gross body and re-enters the spiritual world, then the soul has form. But that soul is also made of ingredients, but they are eternity, knowledge, and bliss, or Sat, Chit, and Ananda. So in Vedic terminology, the gross body is called the Sthula Sharira. The subtle body is called the Linga Sharira. And the soul is the Jiva proper. So let's look at this a little bit more. In the Vedic literatures, we also understand a few more things about this whole setup. Here we have false mind, false intelligence, and false ego, as we said. Sometimes it's just said mind, intelligence, and false ego. I like to add the adjective false, because we do have a real mind, and we do have a real ego, and we do have a real intelligence. But they are different from this. And it's the subtle body which in one sense can be described as our fictitious identity of who we think we are and what we think we want to do. This is in one sense one kind of way of looking at this subtle body. It's this fictitious notion we have of who we are and what we want to do, coupled with our karma, the things we have done in the past, and the things we're waiting to get whacked for, because we haven't gotten whacked for them yet, but eventually we will. And some things that we've done right, which we are waiting to be rewarded for, that also takes place. This mind, intelligence, and false ego in Sanskrit are manas, buddhi, and ahankara. Ahankara is false ego, mind is manas, and buddhi is intelligence. So, same word, Buddha, buddhi, it means intelligence. The subtle body, or the linga sarira, is located in and around the heart of the living entity, in the physical dimension. And through the agency of the life airs and the bloodstream, consciousness is communicated through what is otherwise a dead bunch of chemicals. We call it the actual gross body. So the body only appears alive because it has connected through this linking mechanism to the subtle body through the agency of the life airs and the bloodstream. So the life airs in Sanskrit are called prana, and there are a number of life airs. There are some major ones and there's countless smaller ones. And the subtle body is like buoyant in these airs, and by manipulating them, one can control the gross body in ways that generally we think are impossible. And this is exactly what yogis do. They learn to work with these prana, or these life airs. And by working with these life airs, they are able to do things that we normally think are impossible, like stop your heart or stop breathing, or leave the body at will and go astral traveling, etc., etc. These things are possible by understanding this technology. This is not new technology. We certainly do have a forte for a certain kind of technology in our modern world, no one can doubt. But in previous times, there was a different kind of technology at work which accomplished many of the same tasks that our present technology does. But it did it in a much more elegant way. At any rate, that's a topic for another day. But just to understand that through the agency of these things, something that is in one place, the spirit soul, is working through this, what we call the subtle body. The subtle body, through the bloodstream and the life airs, is controlling the body that everyone understands, the one we see in the mirror, this thing. This is how this whole setup works. This is the descriptions that are there in the Vedic literatures. So naturally, we have been in this body for a long time. And most of us do not remember our previous lives. And over the many years that we've been in this body, everything we've heard, how people refer to us, our modern culture, the whole worldview of the modern thinking, reinforces the idea that we are this body, which in fact we are not. We are in the body, but we are not the body. We never were, and we will one day separate from this body. End of story. And when we do, we will still continue, but the body will not. And it's quite likely we will take yet another body that looks a different way, may speak a different language, may not even be human. So we grow up thinking we're this body, and our society reinforces this notion. No one challenges this notion, and modern science tries to identify us even more with this material form. We are told that the mind is nothing more than various electrical and chemical things happening in the brain. Nothing more than various electrical and chemical things happening in the brain. But of course, no one can give us any details about this. And there are electrical things happening in everybody's brain. But how come I see the world only through the eyes of one particular set of electrochemical patterns? I do not see the world through everybody else's set. I only see it through one vantage point. So we may find some things disturbing about our bodies. I think all of us do. Some things we hate about it. But still, in spite of that, we are deeply attached to this thing. And naturally, when death comes, for most people who have not examined anything deeper, undergone any kind of actual spiritual training or spiritual awakening, their entrance into the world of having this body taken away from them, generally fairly suddenly. If an accident can happen in just literally seconds, but when we get into old age, it can happen over a period of months, and gradually we begin to recognize that we're being pushed out from this body by a disease, a problem, some malfunction. And one soon day we will be no longer inside of it. Yet we are very attached to it. We identify it as ourselves. We genuinely believe that we are the name that people call us. We genuinely believe that we have a nationality, that place on the earth where we were born, and this is somehow very real. We genuinely believe that we have a gender. We genuinely believe that Our body has a certain shape. A few of us really like the shape our body has, most of us not so much. And in this way, we are identifying with something that is a car. And in the regular world, people do identify with their cars. Even when somebody bumps your car, you say, ouch. There are no nerve endings going from you to your car. But we think of it as an external representation of our body. And as our spiritual master Prabhupada used to say, you see the limousine that has the president in it, and you say, oh, there's the president. You haven't seen the body of the president, you've seen his car. So this is a common kind of misconception. And although it's a common way people speak, it helps to reinforce the wrong conception of what's going on. And unless we challenge this misconception, unless we try to think in a different way, when death approaches, as it will for all of us, then we will be really lost in fear, confusion, and a kind of panic, which will not bode well for what will happen next. Because life is not the end of the book. Life is the end of the chapter. You have to go on into the next chapter. And what happens in this chapter will make an important effect and choose what the next chapter will be like. Now, of course, we see that when death occurs, oftentimes the soul is then separated from the body, and it may not immediately go to the next body. There is a lag time. For one reason or another, I'll talk about what some of those reasons are in a minute. But the soul is still attached. The subtle body is still attached to the body that it once inhabited. And because the identification is so strong with the physical body, the subtle body appears to look like, to some extent, the gross body. And if you go to any cemetery or any place where there was a great disaster, you can come in contact with some of the souls or the subtle bodies that were suddenly lost in that disaster, or the place where their remains were finally interred. There, they still inhabit that location. To them, they're still attached to that thing that's rotting away in the ground. They imagine it still to be themselves, and they're afraid to leave it behind. So just think how, in one sense, lamentable such a situation really is. That body is never going to come back to life. They're never going to re-enter that body again. They will re-enter some body at some time in the future. It won't be that one. And the attachment is still there. That's why every cemetery, every place where there's been a very big disaster where many people have left their bodies all at the same time, such places are full of ghosts. And places where people have suffered greatly, places where people have been tortured or left their bodies under very horrible or unspeakable conditions, such places like prisons, insane asylums, and other things like that. These places are great locations for a lot of still disturbed subtle bodies who have not yet progressed on to their next incarnation to remain there. Generally, we see that when there's violence, especially suicide, there is a lag time. Sometimes when a person is violently cast out of their body, there is a lag time before they get their next body. Explains Abraham Lincoln. He was suddenly assassinated. He didn't expect it. Suddenly his life was brought to an end. At that time, he was the United States president. Imagine how many responsibilities and attachments you must have, not only to your body, but to your position and everything else. And suddenly in a moment, the entire thing is over. He's out of his body. He's on to something else. But he remains as a ghost for some time. We see this in Europe with castles which still have the ghosts of some of their illustrious inhabitants wandering the halls. Wherever there is extreme violence, where people have lived very dissolute, selfish, and self-indulgent lives and died under dire circumstances, in such places we can expect to find large quantities of ghosts. And that's why people feel creeped out by cemeteries. There are people who actually see these beings. Most of us don't. I don't. But there are people who, just like some people can read or play music and some cannot, some people have the ability to do artwork with a pen or with brushes, and some do not. So some people have the ability to see this dimension more simply than others. And some people are, in their early days, not even aware that the rest of the world does not see these dimensions. Of course, in one sense, if you can't see these dimensions, you count yourself blessed, because oftentimes this is a whole nother morass of problems. When we go into our world, we certainly don't see harmony. And when we expand our everyday world that we see, there's another dimension outside of it, this world of the not yet reincarnated. This world is also a chaos and a mess. And people there, generally speaking, are not in a happy condition. And they're just as confused as people in this world. And just like when people are bored or they're frustrated, they try to carry out that frustration on whatever person or thing might be in their vicinity. This is why ghosts often create problems for people that are still within a gross material body like you and I. So this is the nature of this. Eventually ghosts will move on in reincarnation. There's a number of reasons why this can happen, and other reasons why it doesn't happen right away. That's a whole discussion in itself. If you're really interested, read the Garuda Purana, where ghosts and these kind of exchanges from one lifetime to another are described. Do yourself a favor, don't read it late at night. At any rate, what we need to see is that people in this subtle body only form of existence that we call ghosts, such people want a solid form just like you and I, because they can't see things or touch them the way we can. And they want to experience the way they were used to experiencing when they once had a body. So this is a very frustrating type of existence to live. Nor is it immediately clear to any of them what it would take to move beyond. And many of them are not inclined to move beyond, thinking that what's beyond might be worse. So, at any rate, this is the nature of this world. You begin to see that when somebody thinks they felt a ghost, or feels a presence, or feels a little shocked, or sees something fade into existence, fade out, someone takes a photograph and there appears to be a face in a window where there's no people living, these things are part of a larger world that you and I all inhabit. And there's no necessity to understand all the details of how it works, because just like this world, it's very complex. There's a number of different things interacting in a number of different ways, so there's no need to understand the details, but at least to understand that this dimension exists. There are entities in it. Some are benign, most are not. Some are frustrated, some are powerful. Some are powerless. And in all cases, there's this sense of deep, frustrated desire among people in this situation. And it indeed is a punishment of sorts. When people commit suicide, then part of that punishment is they don't get another gross body for some time. It was given to them as a gift. They didn't earn it, nor are they, entitled to one just by being alive. But if they got rid of it, then they have to endure a period of time where now they have a subtle body, which they still are housed within, but no gross body. So some people think that committing suicide will end it all. It does not. It just moves you on into a different realm of difficulty. And we could easily make the argument that it's a much more difficult kind of difficulty. So it's not a solution to anything. But if we want to help people who have passed on into this realm, then we can pray for them, ask for the Supreme Lord to give them mercy, and by our prayers and thinking about them, we can see that they will be benefited, and they will hear us thinking about them, and eventually they will be moved on. So there's so much that we don't know about this thing that I'm calling the greater self. The mind, the intelligence, the false ego, the subtle body, the gross body, the spirit soul, the life heirs, all of these things that are going on, and their interaction, and the interaction of karma, what we do one life, spilling over into another life. We are told that basically we are just some kind of chemicals, and we are told that basically our body is made out of DNA, and our characteristics are crafted by that DNA and by our parents and our immediate environment. Nature and nurture is the way it's usually described. But nobody imagines in this view that that soul is coming from a previous life. And that's why even identical twins aren't identical in personality. Each of us came from somewhere else. We are here now. We have this particular gross body. We have a particular form. And this godlike DNA is by far not the whole story. In fact, it's not even really much of the story. Certainly, we understand that DNA is there to transcribe various amino acids, and then those amino acids become proteins. But what about all the rest of the information it takes to make a body? If you were an artist and you were painting a rose, think how much attention you would have to pay to making that rose look like the real one. And of course you'd have to, if you were going to do a realistic representation of it, then you'd have to take into account perspective and shading and all these other things to make it look. But still what you end up with is only a two-dimensional version of a three-dimensional thing. And even that is very difficult to do. Now, if you want to go to the three dimensions like a sculptor, then it's even more difficult, because now you're working in three dimensions and you're trying to remove part of some kind of either some kind of stone or some other kind of substance. And that's much more difficult because now you're working in three dimensions. Now, think about how much more information it would take to describe in great detail what goes into that carving of a rose as opposed to what goes into the painting of a rose. If you wanted to make it really lifelike, then you would have to also paint it as well. And so there's much more going on there. I'm not saying that sculptors are better than artists that work on canvas. Don't get me wrong there. But I'm just saying that just imagine we're going from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions, how much more involved there is. Now let's go one step further. What about what's going inside that rose? No sculptor sculpts the inside of his sculpted object. But we all know that rose has all kinds of pipes and tubings and various things going on inside it. So that's a whole nother dimension. That's the kind of dimension that engineers have to deal with, where you don't only try to mimic something on the outside, but you also mimic its function and its activity on the inside. But of course, no one can do this to any degree like the natural way that we see things. So just understand how complex is a human form. If you were just going to do it in 2 dimensions, if you were going to do it in 3 dimensions, if you were going to talk about the inside and the functionality of it, think how much you would have to describe to actually get that to work the way it is. Is this all done by DNA? I don't think anybody says that. There's something else besides. That is energy that causes the organs to shape in a particular way, that causes them to interact with their neighboring organs in a subsystem. Cells know what color, what type of chemicals they need to take on, and it's different than their next door neighbors who are part of a different tissue. They must work together, and they know what shape to wind up with. They know how big they have to be. And in the overall end product, we have a functioning human body, which is dizzyingly complex. What are the morphic elements that cause it to do that? And as we all know, when a human body or any other biological form is alive, the pchem of that body, of that cell, or whatever we want to say it is, or whatever we want to investigate, the chemistry is jumping through flaming hoops backwards. And the minute that death occurs, either for the cell, the tissue, the body, then immediately all those strange chemical processes begin to stop. Some immediately, some shortly thereafter. And a very different kind of chemistry takes place. There is some other kind of energy that is essential to the way the body works, that is essential to the way the body is crafted. Now, I'm not saying it's all spiritual. I'm sure there's a whole raft of material elements to it, just like what science knows today. In 10 or 50 years, they're going to know more about how these various material energies interact. And if things loosen up, if they're willing to look in other directions, they may find out far more about how the material body works. So this is all a part still of our material world. And it can't be just whisked away by saying DNA did it. So again, I'm going to just wrap this up now with an overview of some of the aspects of ghosts. So ghosts are generally a product of a violent death or a suicide or a violent situation. Ghosts oftentimes feel a need for justice or revenge from whatever it was that murdered them or caused them to suffer. The penalty for suicide is having to wait before you get a new body again. There are reasons why the motion from one lifetime to another is postponed in some cases. When a person is suddenly murdered, usually they get some time to come to grips with it before they're moved on. And if the circumstances were a certain way, they may be that way for a long time. Birthmarks are sometimes carryovers from former deaths or murders. In fact, this is a common thing. Ian Stevenson of the University of Virginia did a study of young children who remembered past lives. And one of the recurring themes he noticed was, as the child would describe, how that child in a previous life as an adult had met his death or her death. Then there would be some accompanying discoloration or change in the character of the tissue in their present body, as if to connect to some extent with that past death. People who were hanged have funny marks on their necks. People who were shot in the head with a rifle have a small birthmark on one part of their head and a larger one in the back where the bullet presumably would have come out. Persons who have had their arms amputated have some strange fingers that don't look normal. These were things he noticed that as a result of some violence in the past, now they're in a new body, but there's kind of a residue from one body leaking over into the forming of the future body. So we see that this subtle body is kind of a blueprint in some ways for how the gross body will turn out in the future. So right now we are building a new gross body in the future by shaping our subtle body. And most of us, when we leave this body, instead of going back to the spiritual world, we will take a new body. And we're fashioning that body right now by the things we do, the things we say. This is the nature of the spiritual explanation. And along with this, we learn that the process of spiritual life dissolves the subtle body, because the subtle body is all things we don't want. We don't want the false ego, we don't want the false intelligence, we don't want the false mind. All these are things that are not at all good for us. And if we engage in devotional service, by degrees, gradually, we will dissolve this subtle body. And then there will only be the soul itself and the gross body. And when the gross body departs, the soul will not re-enter the material world, will not have a new gross body fashioned for itself somewhere in the future. But rather, the soul will go back to the spiritual world, where there is also form, there's activity, there's relationships, all these things. They also exist there. So we can see that human life is not a guarantee. When we leave this body, we may not wind up in another human body. There are a few people who may get upgraded, actually, to a demigod body. But most who don't make it to a human body will be lowered into the animal species. And according to the Vedic literatures, there's 8,400,000 species of living creatures. Each one of these species has a particular forte and a particular karma associated with it. And things that we may want to do very materially, desperately, are easier to do in some of these lower forms. And therefore, if our whole life is centered around a particular material focus, particular material ambition, then the material world may gift that to us, but not in a human form. We can have that in some animal form. And once you have left the human form, then as an animal, you no longer have that full free will that we have as a human being. Animals are driven by their own nature. That's a whole explanation in itself. And they make no choices about spiritual or non-spiritual directions, but it doesn't matter. because animals are just burning off bad karma. That's all that's happening in the animal or plant or even microbial species. So if a person winds up there, they're just burning off bad karma, and gradually, automatically, they'll be promoted up the ladder of more complex and more sophisticated types of life forms, until eventually they come back to the human form. And in the human form of life, there we can actually make choices again and either elevate ourselves in the merits and demerits of karma, or degrade ourselves. Either way, it's up to us. We can do either one of those things. Or better yet, we can stop being involved with karma altogether and engage in the service of the Supreme Lord, and that will eventually get us out of the material world altogether. So it's interesting to note, out of 8,400,000 species of life, 400,000 are just humanish. Just think about that for a minute. There are lots of different humanoids in this world. It's a zoo of human forms, some much better than ours, and some not quite up to the same standard as ours. So the human form, where you do have volition, where you do have some sense of society and of what you can do that's either progressive and spiritually inclined or completely uninterested in such pursuits. So these are ideas that I will tie in as we start talking about other kinds of paranormal phenomena. So, of course, memories of past lives of children demonstrate this idea of an individual going from one lifetime to another, from one group of parents to another, from one name to another name, from one country or at least one region to another region. And in this way we can see that there's a continuity here. This is the Vedic explanation of these things, and it actually does tie together many things that we see in a way of giving an explanation, a purpose, and an understanding of where we might be and where we might want to go. So think about it. We're here every Thursday. This is August 15th, 2019. And so if you want to come to 26 2nd Avenue on Thursday at 7 p.m. to about 8 or 9 p.m., that's when I do this presentation. Actually, every day of the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday and Saturday, there are different programs that are hosted by other different speakers with other different locus of topics. But Thursday is a slot for What's Up With That, where we're investigating the paranormal from a number of different angles and a number of different facets of the paranormal, and tying it all in to a large worldview picture that's very ancient and actually does make sense of all these different, apparently fragmental and mysterious aspects of the world that we inhabit. So thank you all very much. Hare Krishna.